It was an ordinary weekday morning when a man in his 40s went out for his usual errands. He had always preferred to keep a low profile, avoiding the busy rush of the town center when possible. His routine was simple. He would stop by the corner store to pick up a few groceries, run to the post office, and if time allowed, grab a coffee from his favorite cafe. This day, however, something was different. As he walked down the main street enjoying the peacefulness of the moment, he noticed a patrol car slowing down behind him. He barely gave it a second thought, assuming it was just another officer doing his rounds, but then the car stopped. The man's footsteps slowed, his curiosity piqued. From behind the tinted windows of the patrol car, the officer inside watched him closely. The officer rolled down the window slightly and called out to the man. "Hey, you there!" the officer shouted, his voice stern and commanding. The man stopped in his tracks, puzzled. He had done nothing wrong, so he couldn't understand why the officer was speaking to him. He turned to face the officer, his mind racing for any reason why he might have been stopped. "Can I help you, officer?" he asked calmly, maintaining his usual level of composure. The officer's expression was unreadable, his face hard. "You fit the description of a suspect in a nearby robbery. You need to come with me." The man's heart skipped a beat. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but the officer wasn't giving him a chance to explain. His voice remained calm but firm. "I'm just running errands. I haven't been involved in any robbery." The officer wasn't having any of it. "Step over here, now." Confusion filled the man's mind as he stepped closer, trying to understand what was happening. The officer didn't seem interested in hearing his side of the story. Instead, the officer quickly got out of the patrol car and began to approach him. The man looked around. There were a few people walking down the street, but none of them stopped to see what was going on. A few onlookers gave curious glances, but no one stepped forward to intervene. The officer, now standing just a few feet away, pointed at him with a commanding finger. "You're under arrest." "What? Arrest?" The man couldn't believe what he was hearing. He repeated himself more urgently now. "I've done nothing wrong." But the officer was insistent. "You're coming with me." The man's mind raced, but he knew that getting aggressive would only make things worse. He had been taught over the years, whether from his military background or from growing up in a world that wasn't always fair, to stay calm. He had always tried to avoid confrontation, knowing how quickly things could escalate. As the officer moved closer, the man began to feel a strange sense of helplessness. There had to be some mistake. He wasn't a criminal. He was just a man going about his day. The officer, however, wasn't interested in hearing any explanations. The man was already being handcuffed, his wrists feeling tight as the officer pulled him toward the patrol car. The man struggled to keep his balance as the handcuffs bit into his skin. At this point, the bystanders had stopped and were now watching with a mix of curiosity and indifference. No one seemed ready to step in or even speak up. The officer opened the back door of the patrol car, gesturing for the man to get inside. "No," the man protested, but it was futile. He was pushed inside the vehicle. The door slammed shut behind him with a cold finality. The siren began to wail and the car sped off toward the local police station. Inside the car, the man sat in silence. His mind was still reeling, trying to understand what had just happened. Why was he being treated this way? Was it because of his appearance? Was it because he was black? Or had the officer simply made a mistake? The man's thoughts drifted to his life, his family, and his past. He had spent years in service to his country, rising to a respectable position within the military. He had served his time and had earned his retirement. His life had been peaceful, and he had long ago learned to expect the best from others. But now, here he was, sitting in the back of a police car, falsely accused and powerless to do anything about it. The car made its way to the police station, the officer behind the wheel neither apologizing nor explaining anything further. As they arrived at the station, the officer opened the door and ordered the man to step out. The man complied, still struggling to process everything that had happened. His heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts racing. He had been wrongly accused and arrested, and now he was about to face even more questions and scrutiny that he didn't deserve. Inside the station, the man was led to a holding cell. He tried to stay calm, knowing that the situation could spiral out of control if he lost his composure. He stood there, hands still cuffed, staring at the cold walls around him. The sound of other prisoners talking and shuffling in their cells filled the air, but the man didn't pay attention to any of it. He was too focused on what had just happened and how quickly things could go from normal to completely chaotic. The officer who had arrested him walked over to the desk, speaking with a colleague, his back to the man. The man couldn't hear the details of their conversation, but it didn't matter. He already knew what was coming. He would be interrogated, questioned about his life, and probably blamed for something he didn't do. But what worried him most was the fact that, even though he had done everything right, no one seemed to believe him. He had no way of proving that he was innocent. No way to make the officer see that he was simply a man who had been going about his day. As the minutes stretched into hours, the man wondered if anyone would come to his rescue. Would anyone care to ask the right questions, or would he be left here, locked in a cell with nothing but his thoughts? The uncertainty was maddening, but he kept his composure. He knew that no matter how unfair the situation was, losing his temper wouldn't help. And so he waited, trying his best to stay calm, hoping against hope that someone would recognize the mistake that had been made. Outside the cell, the world continued on. People went about their business, oblivious to the man's plight. The officer and his colleagues continued with their work, assuming the man was guilty and not for a second questioning whether they had made a mistake. The man could only wait, wondering how long it would take for the truth to come out, or if he would be stuck in this nightmare forever. The hours seemed to stretch endlessly in the holding cell. The man sat on the cold bench, his mind racing. He kept replaying the events that had led him here over and over again. Every time it felt more surreal. How had this happened? He wasn't a criminal. He had done nothing wrong. Yet there he was, locked up in a small, dimly lit cell, waiting for an explanation that might never come. His wrist still ached from the handcuffs, and his clothes were wrinkled from the way he had been dragged out of the car and into the station. He tried to ignore the discomfort and focus on what to do next. It was clear that no one believed him. The officer who had arrested him hadn't listened to a single word he said, and now he was left to face the consequences of someone else's mistake. The minutes felt like hours, and as time passed, the noise in the holding area grew louder. There were other prisoners, their voices echoing off the walls. Some of them were yelling, some were talking in low voices, and some just sat in silence like the man. The man tried to tune them out, focusing only on the thoughts that kept swirling in his mind. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His thoughts were interrupted when the door to the holding cell opened. The man looked up, half expecting to see the officer who had arrested him standing there, ready to continue questioning him. Instead, it was a different officer, a woman this time. She was carrying a clipboard and looked as though she had a lot on her mind. "Come with me," she said, her tone businesslike. The man didn't argue. He stood up, still feeling a bit disoriented, and walked out of the cell. The woman didn't say anything else as she led him down a narrow hallway. The fluorescent lights above flickered occasionally, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the concrete floors. The man could hear his footsteps echoing through the empty hall, and for a moment it felt like he was walking alone in a world that didn't care about him. They reached an interrogation room. The door was opened and the woman gestured for him to sit at the table in the center of the room. There was a small mirror on one wall, and the man knew from experience that someone would likely be watching him from the other side. His nerves were on edge, but he tried to keep his composure. The woman placed the clipboard down on the table, then sat across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The man could feel the tension in the air. The silence was almost suffocating. Finally, the woman broke the stillness. "Tell me what happened," she said, her voice neutral. It wasn't an accusation, but the way she said it made the man feel like he was still being judged. He took a deep breath and began explaining once again. He told her about the errands he had been running, how he had been stopped by the officer, and how things had escalated so quickly. He explained that he had never been involved in any robbery, that he wasn't a criminal, and that he had no idea why he was being arrested. As he spoke, the woman nodded, occasionally jotting something down on the clipboard. Her face was unreadable, and the man couldn't tell if she believed him. It felt like the more he talked, the more distant she became. It was as if she was listening, but not truly hearing. When he finished, there was a long pause. The woman didn't speak right away. Instead, she looked down at her notes, then back at the man. "I understand," she said finally, her tone softer now but still formal. "But you do understand why the officer acted the way he did, don't you?" The man's frustration flared. "No," he said firmly. "I don't understand. He had no reason to arrest me. I was just walking down the street." The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she pushed a button on the desk and the door behind her opened. A second officer entered the room. The man recognized him immediately. It was the same officer who had arrested him earlier. He didn't know what to expect. Would the officer apologize? Would he finally admit that he had made a mistake? But instead of apologizing, the officer seemed indifferent, as if nothing had changed. "We've run your background," the officer said, speaking to the man with a cold, almost dismissive tone. "You're clean. No prior arrests, no criminal record." The man was relieved to hear that, but it didn't change the fact that he had been wrongfully arrested in the first place. He couldn't understand why the officer had gone so far without even listening to him. The woman turned to the officer. "What now?" The officer glanced at the man before responding. "Well, I don't know. We need to figure out what happened. Maybe there's some confusion, but I'm not sure what the next step is." The man could hardly believe what he was hearing. He had spent hours locked in a holding cell, all because of some mistake or misunderstanding. And now they were telling him they weren't sure what to do. He had been treated like a criminal for hours, and still, no one had even attempted to understand his side of the story. "I don't understand why you're still questioning me," the man said, his voice shaking slightly with frustration. "I've told you everything. I've done nothing wrong." The officer didn't respond. Instead, he just stood there, looking around as though he was trying to figure out what to do next. The silence between the three of them felt heavy, like no one had any answers. The woman sighed and looked back at the man. "I'm sorry this happened to you," she said quietly, though her words seemed hollow. "But I need to ask you to wait for a little longer while we sort this out." And so the man was left to wait once again. He was escorted back to the holding cell, the same cold, empty room where he had spent the last few hours. The door clanged shut behind him, and he sat down on the bench, his mind whirling. It didn't make sense. Everything about the situation felt wrong. He couldn't understand why the officer had been so quick to arrest him, why no one had bothered to check his identity before assuming the worst. It was as though he had been seen as guilty from the moment they laid eyes on him, simply because of his appearance. As the hours passed, the man found himself replaying the situation over and over again in his head. He had been calm, collected. He had tried to explain himself, but it hadn't mattered. The officer had made up his mind before the man had even had a chance to speak. The man had faced countless challenges in his life, challenges that had tested his patience, his strength, and his resolve. But nothing had ever prepared him for this moment. He had never imagined that he would be treated this way. It was as if all the years he had spent serving his country, all the sacrifices he had made, counted for nothing. And yet, he had to remain patient. He couldn't let anger or frustration get the best of him. He had to keep his composure because if he didn't, he feared he would never be able to prove his innocence. The world outside had no idea what was happening to him. Life continued on, indifferent to his struggles. The man could only hope that eventually, someone would recognize the mistake that had been made, and that this nightmare would come to an end. The hours dragged on, and the man found himself stuck in a cycle of uncertainty. He couldn't understand how everything had escalated so quickly. All he had done was run a few errands, yet here he was, locked in a holding cell with no answers, no explanation, and no clear way out. His mind wandered, replaying the events over and over again. Why had the officer reacted that way? Was it because of the man's appearance? Or was there something else at play? As the man sat there trying to process the situation, he noticed something shift in the atmosphere of the station. The hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed to grow louder, and the sound of footsteps in the hallway echoed more intensely. He wasn't sure if it was just his nerves playing tricks on him, but something felt different. A door opened, and the officer who had arrested him, the one with the cold, indifferent face, appeared in front of the holding cell. The man felt his heart rate quicken. Was this it? Was he finally going to get an explanation? Or was he just about to face more questions, more confusion? The officer didn't say anything at first. He just stood there looking at the man. For a moment, the man wondered if this was some kind of trick, but then to his surprise, the officer spoke. "Come with me," he said, his voice flat and unemotional. The man stood up slowly, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. He had no idea where they were taking him. but he was eager to get out of the cell and get some answers. The officer didn't say another word as he led the man down the hallway. The man could feel the weight of the officer's silence. Was this some sort of power play? Did the officer think he was in control of the situation? They reached a small room with a desk and a couple of chairs. It wasn't an interrogation room, but it had the same sterile, cold feel to it. The officer motioned for the man to sit down. "Wait here," the officer said before walking out of the room, leaving the man alone once again. The man sat there, trying to calm his nerves. He had no idea what was happening or what would happen next. His thoughts were a jumble of confusion and frustration.
He had been wrongfully arrested, and no one had bothered to listen to his side of the story.
He had done nothing wrong. So why was he still here? The door opened again and the man's heart skipped a beat. This time it was a different officer who entered. A woman perhaps in her late 30s with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun. She was carrying a folder, her face serious but not unfriendly. "Are you all right?" she asked, sitting down across from him. Her tone was calm, professional, but there was something in her eyes that made the man feel like she was genuinely concerned. It wasn't the cold, detached attitude he had seen from the other officers. "I don't know," the man replied. "I've been waiting here for hours. I don't know what's going on, and I don't know why I'm here. I've told everyone that I'm innocent, but no one seems to care." The woman nodded as if she understood the frustration in his voice. "I know this is difficult, but we need to get to the bottom of what happened. It's our job to figure out what went wrong." The man didn't know whether to feel comforted by her words or more confused. He wanted to believe her, but after everything that had happened so far, he wasn't sure he could trust anyone in that station. "Why am I still here?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Why did the officer arrest me in the first place?" The woman set the folder down on the desk and took a deep breath. "There was a robbery in the area, and you were seen near the scene. The officer who arrested you must have assumed that you were involved because of your proximity to the incident." "But that doesn't make sense," the man exclaimed. "I was just walking down the street. I had nothing to do with any robbery. I'm not even from around here." "I understand," the woman said, her voice softening, "but it's important to understand how these things happen." The officer likely acted out of instinct. He saw someone who might fit the description of the suspect and made the arrest. It's not an excuse, but it's an explanation. The man felt a wave of anger rise in his chest, but he held it back. He didn't want to lose his temper. He had already been through enough. "So you're telling me that he arrested me just because I happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? And now I'm stuck in here because of it?" The woman didn't answer right away. She seemed to be thinking carefully about her response. "I'm not saying that's right, but mistakes happen. We all make them. And now it's up to us to figure out what happened and make it right." The man felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by doubt. How could they make this right? How could they undo the damage that had already been done? The door opened again, and the officer who had arrested the man reappeared. This time his expression was different. It was no longer cold and indifferent, but something more hesitant. He glanced at the woman before looking at the man. "We've run your background check," the officer said, his tone still neutral but not as harsh as before. "And we found something interesting." The man's heart sank. What now? What could they possibly find that would make this situation worse? The officer hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "It seems that there's more to you than meets the eye." The man's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" The officer looked at the woman, who nodded. Then, turning back to the man, the officer said, "We've learned that you're not just a regular civilian. You've got a military background. And not just any military background. You've served as an officer in the United States Army." The man's eyes widened in surprise. "What are you talking about?" "I haven't served in the Army for years." The officer leaned forward. "Your records indicate that you're a retired general. You've been involved in high-level military operations, and you've held a position of great responsibility. The last thing we expected was to find someone like you in this situation." The man couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had spent years in the military, but that was in the past. He had retired and he had tried to move on with his life. But here they were, treating him like a criminal because of a simple mistake. For a moment, there was silence in the room. The officer seemed to be processing the information, and the woman looked at the man with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "I had no idea," the officer said quietly. almost to himself. The woman turned to the man. "Is this true? Are you a retired general?" The man took a deep breath, still trying to wrap his head around everything that was happening. "Yes, I served for many years, but that doesn't change anything. I'm still the same person. I wasn't involved in any robbery." "I believe you," the woman said gently. "But it's clear that there's been some misunderstanding. We'll work on clearing this up." The man nodded, but the feeling of confusion didn't go away. How could all of this have happened? How could someone so high-ranking have been mistaken for a criminal? It was almost too much to comprehend. As the officers began discussing the next steps, the man sat back, still processing the new information. He didn't know where this would lead or how long it would take to clear his name. But one thing was certain. His life had just taken a drastic turn, and he wasn't sure how long it would take to get things back to normal. The next few hours felt like an endless stretch of time. The man, still trying to process everything that had happened, sat in the small interrogation room, his mind racing. He had been in and out of police stations before, but never like this. Never because he was wrongly accused, arrested, and treated like a criminal for no good reason. The shock from discovering that he was a retired general still hadn't fully worn off. He had left that life behind years ago. His uniform was gone, his duties had ended. He had transitioned into civilian life, living peacefully just like anyone else. The past felt distant, almost like a different life altogether. Now here he was, facing a reality that seemed like it belonged in someone else's world. He tried to hold on to the calm composure that had served him well during his time in the army, but the weight of the situation was starting to wear on him. He had done nothing wrong. He had lived a good life. So why was he being treated like this? Why was his word not enough to stop this madness? As he sat in the room, waiting for whatever came next, he couldn't help but think about the officer who had arrested him. The man had been so quick to make assumptions, to label him a criminal without asking a single question. And now, hours later, the same officer was nowhere to be seen. He hadn't come to apologize, hadn't even acknowledged the mistake. In fact, there was no sign of him at all. Instead, the woman officer, the one who had shown some understanding, returned to the room. She had a folder in her hands, but this time she looked more serious, more focused. She walked over to the table where the man was sitting and placed the folder down in front of him. "Listen," she said, sitting across from him. "I know this has been difficult for you, and I'm truly sorry that you've been put in this situation, but we need to talk about how we're going to move forward." The man raised his eyebrows. "How do you plan to move forward? You've already put me in a cell for hours, accused me of something I didn't do, and now you're telling me we need to talk about it?" The woman nodded, acknowledging his frustration. "I understand that you're upset, and I don't blame you. What happened to you was wrong, but we can't undo the past. We can only fix what's happening now." He let out a sigh, leaning back in his chair. "I just don't understand how this could happen. I've given my whole life to my country, and this is how I'm treated." The woman's expression softened. "I don't know what to say. All I can do is promise that we're going to fix this, but it's not going to be quick. The officer who arrested you, he acted out of instinct. He didn't know who you were. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know who I was." The man's voice shook with disbelief. He didn't even bother to find out. Instead, he just assumed the worst. "I know, and that's what we need to address. The department is going to look into this. The officer will be questioned, and the entire situation will be reviewed." The man's frustration continued to simmer beneath the surface. "That doesn't change what's happened. It doesn't undo the damage. I'm not some random person off the street. I've served my country for years. I didn't deserve this." The woman was quiet for a moment, her eyes locked on the man. She seemed to be searching for the right words. Finally, she spoke. "I know, and I promise you that we will make sure this never happens again." The man didn't respond. Instead, he just sat there, staring at the table. The room felt heavier with each passing second. The silence stretched on until the woman finally spoke again. "I know this isn't enough, but I want to make sure you know we're working on this, and I'm going to personally see to it that this is resolved." The man didn't say anything. What could he say? There was nothing that would change the way he felt in that moment. The damage was already done. After another long pause, the woman stood up. "I'll be back soon with an update. Just hang in there a little longer." She left the room, and the man was once again left to his thoughts. He didn't know how long he would be stuck here, or what the next steps would be. But one thing was clear. His life had been turned upside down in the span of a few hours. The more he thought about it, the more the unfairness of it all sank in. He had been an officer himself, responsible for making life-changing decisions. He had worked alongside other officers, done things that most people couldn't even begin to imagine. Yet here he was in the same place he had sent countless people to over the years. It was a bitter irony that he couldn't shake. As the hours ticked by, the man found himself lost in thought. His life, which had once felt so sure, now felt like it was in a constant state of flux. He had always believed that justice would prevail, that things would work out in the end. But now, in this cold, sterile room, he wasn't so sure anymore. He didn't know how long he'd been sitting there when the door opened again. This time, it wasn't the woman officer who entered. Instead, it was the same officer who had arrested him earlier, the one who had acted so quickly without a second thought. He stood in the doorway looking uncomfortable, as though he wasn't sure how to proceed. "Can we talk?" the officer asked, his voice lower than it had been earlier. There was something in his tone that was different this time. It wasn't the same confidence, the same arrogance. It was almost apologetic. The man looked up at him, still processing everything. "Talk about what?" The officer took a hesitant step into the room and closed the door behind him. "I wanted to apologize for what happened. I made a mistake. A big mistake." The man sat still for a moment, unsure of what to say. The officer's apology, though sincere, didn't change the fact that he had caused a lot of pain. But the man was tired of being angry, tired of fighting, so he simply nodded. "I'm sorry," the officer repeated. "I shouldn't have done what I did. I was wrong." The man looked the officer in the eye. "You were, but I appreciate you coming here to say that." The officer seemed to relax a little, his shoulders loosening. "I never meant for any of this to happen. It was just a mistake. But I know that doesn't make it right." "No," the man said, his voice steady. "It doesn't," the officer nodded. "I've been spoken to by my superiors. There will be an investigation into the way I handled things. They're going to look into everything. I'll accept whatever consequences come my way." The man didn't respond. There was nothing he could say that would change what had happened. He wasn't looking for a personal apology. He just wanted this nightmare to end. "I know it's not enough," the officer said, his voice almost a whisper, "but I wanted you to know that I regret what happened." "I really do," the man nodded again. "Thank you." The officer stood there for a moment longer before turning to leave. "I'll be in touch soon, just hang in there." As the door closed behind him, the man sat quietly in the room, the weight of the situation still pressing on his chest. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. This experience had changed him. It had shown him how quickly things could spiral out of control, how easily assumptions could be made, and how difficult it could be to correct a mistake once it was made. And so, he waited. He waited for the investigation to unfold. He waited for the justice that was promised to him. And most of all, he waited for his life to return to normal, though he wasn't sure if it ever would. Days passed before anything significant happened. The man continued to sit in that small room, his patience wearing thin. It was almost as if time had slowed down, stretching out the hours until they became an unbearable weight. The events that had unfolded over the past few days kept replaying in his mind, each time adding new layers of confusion and frustration. The officer's apology had been sincere, but it hadn't changed the fact that he was still stuck here waiting for a resolution. He wasn't sure if it was the department's process or just the way the system worked, but every hour felt like an eternity. His thoughts wandered to the life he had left behind, the career he had worked so hard for, the sacrifices he had made. It all seemed so distant now, almost like another life. How could something so trivial, something as simple as a misunderstanding, turn his? Each day in the holding room seemed to blend together. He was allowed out for meals and brief walks, but most of the time, he stayed in his small, uncomfortable cell. He would sit in silence, thinking about everything that had happened and wondering when this nightmare would finally end. Then, one afternoon, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, the door to his cell opened. This time, it wasn't the same officer or the woman who had initially tried to help him. It was someone new. A man dressed in a suit, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "Mr. Turner?" the man asked, his voice calm but authoritative. The man blinked, surprised. He hadn't heard the name Turner in a while. He had assumed it was his assigned alias for the moment. though it wasn't his real name. The man stood up slowly, still a little disoriented. "Yes, that's me," the man nodded. "I'm Detective Jacobs. I've been assigned to look into your case. We need to talk." The man's heart skipped a beat. Finally, he was going to get answers. He followed Detective Jacobs down the hallway to a small office. This time the room was different, cozier, with a desk and chairs that seemed more welcoming than the sterile, cold rooms he had been in before. Once they were seated, Detective Jacobs placed a file on the desk between them. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the contents before looking up at the man. "I've been reviewing your case," Jacobs said, his voice steady. "And I'm afraid I have some bad news, but I also have good news." The man leaned forward, his heart racing. He had been through so much that the last thing he expected was more bad news. "What do you mean?" Jacobs hesitated before continuing. "I know you've been here for days now, and I know the situation hasn't been handled well. But the bad news is that there's been a delay in processing the evidence. There are still some discrepancies with the reports. We're working on it, but it's going to take a little more time before we can release you." The man's frustration bubbled up again. "More time? How much more time? I've been waiting for days. What more do you need?" Jacobs raised his hand slightly, trying to calm the situation. "I understand your frustration, but please understand that these things take time. We're working as fast as we can." The man closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He had heard all this before. He had been patient, but the situation seemed to be dragging on forever. He had hoped that someone, anyone, would come in and take charge, and this nightmare would be over. But instead it felt like they were only digging deeper into the hole. "Okay, what's the good news?" the man asked, his voice low. Jacobs looked at him, his expression softening. "The good news is that we've confirmed your identity. We know who you are now, and that changes everything." The man's heart skipped again. "What do you mean you know who I am?" "We've verified your military background. We've contacted the Pentagon and your former colleagues. We know you were a general in the United States Army, and that's going to make a huge difference in how we proceed." The man sat back, his mind whirling. The confirmation of his identity had come too late to stop the damage that had been done, but it was still something that might help clear his name. "So now what happens?" Jacobs paused for a moment, then continued. "Now we're working on clearing everything up. The officer who arrested you will be placed under review. There will be a full investigation into what happened, and I promise you that we're going to take this seriously. You're not just another case. You're someone who served our country, and that's not something we're going to ignore." The man nodded slowly, trying to digest everything. It wasn't the quick resolution he had hoped for, but it was something. It was a step in the right direction. "So what happens to me now?" Jacobs looked at him seriously.
"We're going to make sure you're released as soon as possible."
"We just need a little more time to wrap everything up, but once we have everything in order, we'll get you out of here." The man sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything finally beginning to lift. It wasn't over yet, but it was finally starting to feel like it would be. He wasn't going to be stuck here forever. He wasn't going to be treated like a criminal. At least not anymore. Jacob stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "I know it's not easy, but thank you for your patience. We'll be in touch soon, and I'll make sure to keep you updated." The man nodded and stood up as well, feeling the first real sense of relief since this ordeal had begun. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "I appreciate it." As Jacobs left the room, the man stood there for a moment, allowing himself a small sigh of relief. It wasn't the happy ending he had imagined, but it was the beginning of one. It was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when things would finally start to be set right. As the days passed, the process moved slowly but steadily. The officer who had arrested him was placed under review, and the investigation into his actions began. The department took his case seriously, and with each passing day, the man felt more confident that his name would soon be cleared. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man was released. He stepped out of the police station, blinking in the sunlight as he breathed in the fresh air. It felt like freedom, something he hadn't felt in days. He wasn't sure what his next steps would be, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was in control of his own life again. It had been a long road, and he knew that it wasn't over yet. There would still be a lot of paperwork to deal with, a lot of people to talk to, but at least now he had his dignity back. At least now he could go back to his life. As he walked away from the station, he couldn't help but think about the people who had helped him through this. The woman officer who had shown some understanding, the detective who had worked on his case. These were the people who had made a difference. They had fought for justice even when the system didn't seem to care, and for that he would be forever grateful. It had been a hard lesson to learn, but in the end, the man understood something important. No matter how unjust the world seemed, there were always people willing to fight for what was right, and that gave him hope. He wasn't just a victim of a mistake anymore. He was a man who had fought for his name, for his honor, and for the truth, and that in the end was what mattered most. The days that followed were filled with a sense of relief but also a lingering uncertainty. The man had finally been released from custody, but his life hadn't returned to normal. Not yet. He couldn't help but feel like he was still walking on a tightrope, uncertain of what would happen next. The investigation was still ongoing, and the officer who had wrongfully arrested him was still under review. But for the man, the feeling of freedom, of being out of that cold, sterile cell, was something he hadn't taken for granted. Each morning, he woke up with a sense of heaviness in his chest. The reality of what had happened to him had not fully settled. It was hard to believe that such a simple misunderstanding could disrupt everything. He had been a soldier, a leader, respected, trusted, but in a moment all of that had been called into question. He had been treated like a criminal, and now he was left to piece together the fragments of his life. He spent his days in solitude, trying to regain a sense of normalcy. He had been given time to rest, but there was still something eating away at him, the need to understand why this had happened. How had he ended up in that situation? How had an officer, one who had sworn to protect and serve, decided that he was guilty without so much as a question? His phone rang one morning, the sound of it cutting through the silence of his apartment. He hesitated for a moment before answering. It was the detective, Jacobs. "Mr. Turner," Jacobs said, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "We have an update on your case. I need you to come down to the station. We've made some progress and we need to speak with you." The man felt a wave of anxiety rise in his chest. He had been hoping for closure, but the constant reminders of his ordeal were starting to take a toll. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We've made some breakthroughs. It's important. We'll explain everything when you get here," Jacobs replied before ending the call. The man sat there for a moment, unsure of what to expect. He had hoped that everything would be sorted out by now, that the truth would be clear and he could move on. But now, there was a sense of urgency in Jacob's voice that suggested things were far from over. He wasn't sure whether to be hopeful or worried, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to go to the station and face whatever was coming. When he arrived at the station, Jacobs was waiting for him in the same small office they had met in before. The detective didn't waste any time. As soon as the man entered the room, Jacobs motioned for him to sit. "I won't keep you waiting any longer," Jacobs began, his voice serious. "We've completed our investigation into the officer who arrested you. We've reviewed the body camera footage, interviewed witnesses, and examined all the evidence. The findings are clear. The officer acted recklessly and without cause." The man's heart skipped a beat. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. "So what happens now?" Jacob sat back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. "We've made the decision to move forward with disciplinary action. The officer will be facing consequences for his actions. He will be suspended pending further review, and there will be a full inquiry into his conduct. This isn't something we take lightly." The man nodded, though he still couldn't shake the anger that lingered. "What about my record? What about the damage this has done to my life?" Jacobs leaned forward. "We're working on that too. We've been in contact with the higher-ups and they've agreed to assist in clearing your name. You won't be charged with any crimes and your record will be expunged. You've been wronged and we're doing everything we can to make it right." For the first time in days, the man felt a sense of hope. It wasn't over yet, but it was a step forward. "And what about the officer?" he asked, the bitterness in his voice impossible to hide. Jacobs looked at him carefully. "The officer is facing serious repercussions. We're making sure that he's held accountable, but I need you to understand that these things take time. The system isn't always quick to act, but we're on the right track." The man nodded, still unsure of how he felt. It wasn't enough. Nothing could undo the humiliation, the stress, or the sense of betrayal he felt. But at least there was progress. At least he could finally see a light at the end of the tunnel. "I appreciate you keeping me informed," the man said, his voice quiet but sincere. Jacobs gave him a small nod. "We're doing our best, and I promise you we won't let this go." With that, the man stood up and left the station, his mind swirling with the news he had just received. He wasn't sure how long it would take for everything to be fully resolved, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a chance to take control of his life again. Days turned into weeks, and as time passed, the man slowly began to regain some sense of normalcy. He returned to his old routine, focusing on work and other personal goals, but the shadow of what had happened still hung over him. Every time he thought about the incident, a part of him was still angry. It wasn't just the mistake that had been made. It was the way he had been treated, the way his honor and integrity had been questioned without so much as a second thought. He spent hours reflecting on the lessons he had learned during the ordeal. In some ways, it had given him a new perspective on life. He realized that even when things seemed to be stacked against you, there were still people who cared enough to help you. And while the system might be flawed, it wasn't entirely broken. There was still a chance for justice to prevail. Months later, the officer who had arrested him was officially reprimanded. The department issued an apology, and the man's record was cleared. He had been vindicated, and though the emotional scars still remained, he felt a sense of peace. The truth had been revealed, and his name was finally cleared. He hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. In fact, he had feared that this would be the kind of thing that would drag on for years. But in the end, justice had been served, and that was something he could hold on to. As the man walked through his life, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just a victim of circumstance anymore. He was someone who had fought for his rights, for the truth, and for justice. He had faced adversity and come out on the other side stronger, and with that, he knew he could face anything that came his way. As the man sat in his small apartment, he found himself staring at the same spot on the wall, lost in thought. The journey he had gone through over the past few months felt like a strange dream. The days had blurred together, but one thing was certain. He had emerged from the storm stronger and more aware of the world around him. What he had experienced had shaken him, but it had also given him a clarity he had never known before. The months had passed since the officer's suspension, and his name had finally been cleared. He had worked hard to restore the damage that had been done to his life. His reputation had been tarnished, his dignity questioned, but now all of that was slowly being restored. The apology from the department had been sincere, but it didn't erase the scars left by the events. Still, he knew that he had fought for what was right, and in the end, that was what mattered most. Yet as time moved on, the man couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. There was an emptiness within him, a void that he couldn't seem to fill. The long hours he spent at work, the quiet evenings at home, it all felt hollow. He had rebuilt his life to an extent, but something deep inside told him that he hadn't truly moved on. One evening, as he walked back to his apartment after another long day, he saw a familiar face across the street. The woman officer, the one who had shown him kindness when no one else did, was standing by her car looking around as if searching for someone. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither of them moved. It had been months since they had last spoken, but in that instant, it felt like no time had passed at all. Without thinking, the man crossed the street, his footsteps quickening as he approached her. "Hey," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. She turned to face him, a small smile on her lips. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I know," the man replied, his voice warm. "I've been meaning to thank you." She raised an eyebrow, surprised. "For what?" "For everything. For believing me when no one else would. For showing me that there are people out there who still care about doing the right thing." The woman smiled, a look of understanding passing between them. "I was just doing my job," she said simply. "But I appreciate you saying that. It wasn't easy, but I knew you weren't guilty." They stood there for a moment, the weight of their past experiences hanging in the air. The man couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude toward her, a feeling that he hadn't been able to express until now. "I've been thinking about everything that happened," he said after a pause, "and I've come to realize that it wasn't just about me. It wasn't just about the officer who arrested me. It was about the system as a whole, about how we sometimes forget to look at the bigger picture. The woman nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. I've been thinking the same thing. This case, your case, it showed me how easy it is for things to go wrong. How quickly a person can go from being a respected member of society to someone who's labeled as a criminal. The man sighed, his breath heavy with the weight of those words. It's not just the big things that affect us. It's the small things too, the assumptions, the judgments. They all add up, and before we know it, we're caught in something we didn't even see coming. The woman's eyes softened as she looked at him. You're right. It's easy to overlook the human side of things, to forget that everyone has a story, a past, a reason for being who they are. There was a long pause, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't awkward, though. It was just two people who had been through something difficult, something that had changed them in ways they hadn't expected. And in that silence, they both understood something that neither of them could put into words. Finally, the man broke the silence. I've learned a lot from this whole experience. Not just about myself, but about the world around me. I've learned that we have to keep fighting for what's right. Even when the odds are stacked against us, we can't give up. The woman smiled softly. You're a strong person, and you should be proud of what you've done. Not many people could have gone through what you did and come out the other side the way you did. He nodded, his heart swelling with a sense of pride. I couldn't have done it without people like you. People who are willing to stand up for what's right even when it's hard. The woman's smile widened. You give me too much credit, but I'm glad I could help. You've made a difference. You've made sure that something good came out of all of this. The man smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in months. Maybe it's not all bad. Maybe we just need to remember that things don't always go the way we expect. But that doesn't mean we can't find something positive in it. She nodded, her eyes reflecting the same understanding. I think that's what I've learned too. They stood there for a few more moments talking about life, about what they had learned from their respective journeys. It wasn't a conversation about justice or what had happened to him. It was a conversation about who they were now, and how they had both grown from their experiences. When they finally said their goodbyes, the man felt a sense of closure that he hadn't realized he needed. There was still much to be done, but now he felt more at peace with himself. The weight of the past still lingered, but it didn't have the same power over him. He had learned to let go, to accept the things he couldn't change, and to focus on what he could do moving forward. As he walked back to his apartment that evening, the streets felt different. There was a renewed sense of purpose in his step, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. He had faced one of the hardest battles of his life, and had come out on the other side not just intact, but stronger, and now as he moved forward, he understood something important. No matter how much darkness you face, there's always a way to find the light, and that light, no matter how small it might seem, is worth fighting for. The man had fought for justice, for his name, and for what was right, and in the end, he had not only found peace, but he had found a new understanding of the world and of himself, and that, in the end, was worth more than anything he could have ever imagined. The days had passed since the man had met the officer outside his apartment, and things were slowly returning to a new sense of normal. Life was moving forward, but there was still a part of him that couldn't let go of everything that had happened. He had been wronged, yes, but he had also grown from it, and that change within him was profound. He had learned more about himself and the people around him in a way he hadn't expected. Despite everything that had occurred, his confidence was stronger than before. He had been through something that most people would find hard to recover from, but he had found a way to rebuild. His reputation was restored, and the apology from the department had been given. Still, he couldn't help but feel like a small part of his life was still missing. One evening, while he was enjoying some quiet time at home, there was a knock at his door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and that alone made him curious. He opened the door to find a man standing there holding an envelope. Mr. Turner? The man asked, his tone polite. Yes, that's me, the man replied. A bit surprised. I have something for you, the man said, handing him the envelope before turning and walking away without saying another word. The man stood there for a moment, confused. He opened the envelope and pulled out a letter. It was from the police department, but it wasn't just any letter. It was an official document, confirming that the officer who had arrested him had been officially dismissed from the force. The department had conducted a full investigation, and it had been determined that the officer's actions were indeed unjust. As he read through the details, the man felt a mix of emotions. Relief, anger, even a sense of vindication. The system had worked, but not without causing him pain in the process. He had waited so long to hear those words that acknowledged the injustice done to him. It felt good to know that the truth had finally been recognized, but there was something about the way everything had unfolded that still left a bitter taste in his mouth. He had been treated unfairly, but now there was some sense of justice. The officer had been dismissed, and though that would not undo the damage caused, it was a step toward accountability. And for the man, that was something. But it was not just the officer's actions that had shaped his life. It was the way the entire system had reacted. There was something wrong with the way things worked, he thought. Too often people were judged based on assumptions, not facts. He had been lucky. He had people who had believed in him, who had seen him for who he really was. But how many others had been trapped in a similar situation, unable to escape? How many had faced injustices like his without the support he had received? As he continued to reflect, the man realized that he wanted to do more. He couldn't just walk away from everything that had happened and move on. He couldn't simply forget about the people who had suffered because of the broken system. There had to be a way for him to make a difference. He had experienced firsthand what it felt like to be wrongfully accused, and he knew he couldn't just let that be the end of his journey. Determined, he began looking for ways to contribute. He reached out to organizations that focused on criminal justice reform, offering his experience and insight. He spoke with others who had faced similar situations, listening to their stories and learning from their struggles. It was clear to him that the path forward wasn't about seeking revenge or harboring resentment. It was about working toward a system where people were treated with dignity and respect, no matter their background or the mistakes they made. The work wasn't easy, and there were moments when he felt discouraged. The system was large and complex, and the problems ran deep. But there were moments of hope, too. There were small victories, stories of people who had fought back, who had demanded justice, and who had been heard. The man knew that change was slow, but it was possible. It wasn't just about one person. It was about collective action, about standing together to create a world where fairness and truth triumphed over assumptions and bias. As the months went by, the man's life began to take on a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just living for himself anymore. He was living for something larger, something that he could give back to the world. He began volunteering with advocacy groups, sharing his story, and helping to raise awareness about the need for justice reform. He spoke at events, met with lawmakers, and worked with other advocates to push for meaningful changes in how the justice system treated people, particularly those from marginalized communities. Through his work, the man encountered many challenges. Not everyone was as open to change as he was, and there were times when he felt like he was fighting an uphill battle, but he kept pushing forward, refusing to give up on the dream of a better system. He had seen the flaws in the system, and he knew that the only way to make things better was to keep advocating for justice, even when it seemed impossible. One day, while he was speaking at a community event, he was approached by a woman who had been listening to his speech. She was a lawyer who worked in criminal defense, and she told him how much his story had inspired her. She explained that she had been working with clients who had been wrongfully convicted, and she wanted to find a way to collaborate on efforts to prevent such injustices from happening in the future. The man felt a surge of hope at the thought of working with someone so passionate and dedicated. He had always believed that change was possible, and this conversation confirmed that there were people out there who shared his vision. Together, they began to brainstorm ideas for raising awareness about the problems within the criminal justice system. They started organizing workshops and outreach programs, reaching out to communities that had been affected by wrongful arrests and convictions. Over time, the man began to see the impact of his work. He saw the way people's eyes opened when they heard stories like his. He saw the change in the way people viewed the justice system, and he felt a sense of accomplishment that was far greater than anything he had ever felt before. But even as he helped others, he still carried with him the memory of his own experience. It was something that would always stay with him, a reminder of the injustice he had faced. Yet it was also a reminder of his resilience, his determination to fight for what was right, and his belief in the power of truth. One evening, As he sat in his office reflecting on how far he had come, he received a phone call from an old friend. The friend had heard about his work and wanted to reconnect. The conversation was warm, filled with memories of the past, but also with a sense of pride in what the man had accomplished. "I always knew you had it in you," the friend said, his voice filled with admiration. The man smiled, his heart full of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without the people who believed in me," he replied. In that moment, the man realized that the journey was not just about him. It was about all the people who had stood by him, the people who had supported him even when things seemed hopeless. He wasn't alone in his fight. There were others who shared his vision, who were working toward the same goal, a world where justice prevailed, where people were treated fairly and equally. And as he looked back on everything he had been through, the man understood one thing clearly. No matter how difficult the road, there was always a way forward, and it was the people you met along the way who made all the difference.